and welcome to WriteHive and our talk today on creating fantasy languages or creating languages in fantasy. Thank you so much for joining us, y'all. And as I may introduce people, would you please just say a couple of things about yourself, whatever pops off the top of your head. How are you, Monique?
Hey, I am good. Is your name Buffalo or Sean?
Exactly. I am Buffalo Sean, and I will leave it at that.
Okay, I'm doing well. I hope everyone else is doing the same.
Heck yeah. Monique, what have you been working on lately, or do you have a book that came out lately?
Right now I'm working on maybe YA. I haven't really categorized it yet. Fantasy. So that's what I'm working on.
Work in progress, absolutely. And editing hell. Oh my God, I'm so in editing hell every day of my life. Anna, how are you today?
I'm great. I'm really excited about this.
Heck yeah. And are you working on anything? I see Navigating Ruins there up on the screen. Is that available now?
It is out now, and I have 2 stories in it. That's mainly what I do. I write short stories, usually science fiction, sometimes horror, sometimes weird, things like that. Yeah.
Nice. I love how weird is becoming its own category. Like it's this
Yep.
metastasizing outgrowth out of sci-fi and literary. CJ, hello, and very cool to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here with the rest of the panelists as well. Yeah, I'm just really looking forward to it. And sorry if my teeth turn yellow or orange or any other weird color. It's the background is bleeding through.
Yes, so the audience was not here for our check right before this, but we had fun with backgrounds and lots of colors flying all over the place and stuff like that. So yes, if strange things happens, it's just part of the weird. We're getting weird today, absolutely. CJ, do you have anything that has recently come out or that you're working on you'd like to say about?
Yes, so right now I'm working on my young adult fantasy novel, which I pitched in DV Pit as Desi Squid Game meets 1001 Nights. And yeah, it got a bit of attention, so I'm reworking, I'm putting in everything that I wanted to put in before I let it go to debut. And one of those things was, of course, my own pictographic language, which I created for the novel.
Nice, heck yeah, very cool. KJ, hello. Thank you. Hope you're having a good day. And do you want to tell us about Bloodflower or anything else you're working on?
Yeah, so Bloodflower is out now. It's a very grimdark science fantasy. It's aimed toward adults, but you know, I mean, if you're 16, 17 and want to read it, have fun. I'm working on the second novel, Iron Star, and kind of picking at some short stories with side characters. So expect more short stories in the future and possibly another anthology.
Nice, very cool. Thank you. Let's say this. So I want to start off just as a author sitting on the sidelines and ask you guys, maybe Anna, I can ask you to start off with, why should a fantasy or other author create a language for their world?
I don't know why they should. I can tell you a little bit about why I did once. And it started out, I wanted to create a language barrier in a story, but I didn't want to rely on a real language to do that. I wanted to abstract a language in a way. That's why I did that.
Heck yeah. And Anna, if I'm correct, you work with linguistics as well, with computers?
I do. I'm a linguist in my day job, computational linguist. I work with speech recognition and also speech synthesis. So I spend my days thinking about the structures of languages and the idiosyncrasies of languages, also what languages have in common, and how to teach a computer to understand and to produce language.
Nice. CJ, do you have anything to say about why should an author create a language?
I think, like Anna said, you don't necessarily have to, but oftentimes you can create a language if you want to add more dimension to your world building. I think that's one of the reasons why when I was writing my novel, one of the reasons I created the language is because it didn't seem plausible that the characters in this fictional world wouldn't have their own language. So if it makes sense, I say do it. And I think that's really cool, computational linguistics. I have a background in neurolinguistics, so I do more work with the brain and linguistics.
It's fascinating. Any aspect of language, linguistics just grabs my attention. Yeah.
We're totally at like cyborg by this point, neurolinguistics and computational all together. But we're talking about fantasy as well. So elves and fairies in the woods and mermaids out of the ocean. Monique, did you have anything as far as cultures go or anything that you were putting together that made you want to make a create a language for your work?
Excuse me. Yes, so I am Gullah Geechee, and Gullah is a language that not many people really know about, or have heard, either have read or have heard spoken. So in my current work in progress, I am using the Gullah language a lot in the manuscript. And I wanted to use the Gullah language because, one, I want to provide more representation and transparency about my culture. And then two, I think it's a very rich and beautiful language that has a history of being repressed and considered like broken or unintelligent language. And so now it's finally being valued for the language that it is.
Very cool. And definitely, while let's say like on a surface level or something like that, people will have criticisms of different languages that they don't understand. We have definitely two scholars here who have worked with things in many different ways about linguistics, and that is where you can see the depth and where you can see the complexity of a language. So I'll definitely loop around back to that, because Gullah culture and language is both a story of survival as well as a great part of American history. I love it. Absolutely. KJ, if I can kind of twist the question a little bit, let's say this. So let's say there's 3 degrees of creating a language, coining a word, droids. It's easy. You just throw droids in there. You fit it into English text. Or a pigeon, you have general rules, words specific to the story, or like a full conlang. You do all the background work and a little sprinkling of it ends up in your work. What would you say that you do in the work?
It's stalking me, haven't you? I personally create the full language. Years ago, when, after playing Myst, I was so excited about the Denis language and the number system and just the way that they really wove it into their world. So I actually learned it for a while. I was learning like how a base 5 system works, and it was a lot of fun.
The language from Myst, from the video game.
Yeah, they keep it in all the games. They've done a full writing system. They use a base 5 mathematical system, which is very different from ours. And then they wrote 3 books in the series that are they're about, Gen and Atris, and it's kind of wrapped around the original Myst game where, the sons kind of betray their father. But even in the book, you can see this language that's spoken every day by this culture. And then you also eventually get to go back and see sort of where the Denis came from, and their older culture, and how they've made this gorgeous world that's built upon this horrible nightmare. So, but anyway, yeah, for Bloodflower, I created an entire language. I've got a full compendium and dictionary, and I've got double meanings for a lot of it. And then one of the things I did is, because the culture in the book, I've got 2 main characters that are divided by 4,000 years. So their languages carry some similar words, but for the most part, they're very different. They've, one's evolved and one's more common speak. So what I did is I thought, okay, how would this look to each culture? So what I did, for Jaden, her culture's language is sound based. So every single type of sound has its own character. And as it grew, they lost the diacritics, they lost some of the accents. And so by the time you get to John's world, 4,000 years later, there are a lot of similar sounds, but a lot of the fanciness has fallen off of it and it's become more simplified.
French and Quebecois, absolutely. Just to do a deep dive into how distance can absolutely do that. But let me say, follow up, KJ, why would you say that an author who's watching this should create a conlang?
I wouldn't say that, honestly. As much as I love creating languages, you really have to look at the story. If somebody's writing a romance that's set in modern Louisiana, and, maybe a language that you're going to bring in is a little bit more of the modern voodoo, or, some of the French Quarter lingo, the Creole French, but they're not going to build an entire language around that. So it doesn't make sense. But when you're building an entirely new world, an entirely new system, and you have to put these characters into this culture that you've created, then you have to have something that they can play off of. Even if it's just a couple words. Star Wars had droids, like you said. George R.R. Martin only wrote like 7 phrases of Dothraki before he handed it over, and now it's a complete language. So I say if you're writing modern, you really don't need to, unless it's, a tool that you're using to kind of create some depth in your characters. But if you're writing a full fantasy world, yeah, you should at least play with a few words that give that world meaning.
It creates depth, as you said, absolutely.
Yeah.
CJ, if I can ask, when it comes to creating a language, what are the influences you use, in your own work?
Well, for my most recent conlang that I created, I based it on other pictographic and logographic languages as inspiration. So Sanskrit and Hanzi. I think that basing it on.
Sorry to interrupt. Where is Hanzi from?
Hanzi is the Chinese pictographic system.
Cool.
Yeah, so I do speak Mandarin as well. So being familiar with that language did help me in creating this one. However, they're very, very different. So I would say if you are trying to create a conlang, start first with the sounds. That's where I would start if you need it to be a communicative language. My language is not necessarily spoken, so it doesn't need phoneticization. So some languages will require that. Some languages only need to be seen in the story and not actually heard. So if that's the case, then you don't really need any sounds. But I generally start with sounds for languages because I think what you're basing a language on, it should be a mode of communication and a mode of transmitting information. So always remember that and keep that as a foundation and build on that. So I don't know if that answers your question, Sean.
No, that's great. Absolutely. And really, we're just bouncing around. If y'all are ever like, hey, I liked that last question better, jump around, no problem, twist it up. Anna, what influences would you say you use, when creating a language? Or
I personally, when I'm reading, I always perk up most when there's a language that cannot be physically produced by one of the people that are trying to be communicated. I think, that the movie or the story by Ted Chiang, The Arrival, is maybe an example where a language like is mind-blowing to someone else. Or recently, Andy Weir project Hail Mary, there's a language that based on chords, sounds that occur at the same time. You cannot produce that as a humanoid, let's call it. I'm fascinated by those. I haven't created one of those, but I'm really inspired to try that, because that also raises issues of language accessibility. How do you communicate with someone who's like, who cannot produce your language like physically? It's fascinating. But when I go about, I do it sort of very academically. I start with meaning. I first make it clear to myself, why do I want this language at all? What does it contribute to the world, to the conflict, to the culture that I'm trying to build? And then I tend to start with like maybe a phrase. This one story I wrote, one character has this like a mantra or something that she comes, a sentence from her favorite book. And later on, she meets another character who knows the same book, but in translation. So I started out with that sentence, and then I just sort of wrote it down in English. And then I made up the sounds or the syllables for the conlang. And then my favorite part is thinking about the grammatical features of another language. And for that, I look at what I know about world languages, and that's where my nerd kicks in, and I love it. So I start thinking about, okay, so how do we express a plural in this language? Maybe we have a way of saying exactly 2 of this thing, or exactly 3. What does that say about the culture who has such a thing in their grammar? I love thinking about like the verbal system. Do they have tenses? Maybe the culture perceives time differently. Do they have a past tense? Do they do it differently? Do they do it with adverbs? Do they have maybe different levels of politeness that's sort of ingrained in the culture? Gender, super interesting. Do nouns have genders? What kinds of pronouns do they have? You know, what can you express in a pronoun in that language? And what does it say about the culture? That's where I go, and I love doing that. So looking at like the grammatical things I can tag onto words, I love for that.
Yes, no, I mean, the depth of character in there, and you're reminding me as well of China Mieville and Embassy Town, where the alien species that they meet have 2 people, or 2 aliens, but that their voices speaking together is how the language is spoken. There's no way for an individual to speak it. They never do anything with it as a conlang or whatever in the book, but just the idea of it being there is terribly interesting. Absolutely. Monique, if I can ask, how do you feel like you ease a reader into a conlang? If you're putting a bit of Gullah into your novel, into a YA book, do you start off small with translations? Do you feel like you need to hand walk the reader into that, or just full bore?
Thank you, Buffalo Sean. I love saying your name. Well, Gullah isn't a conlang, of course, but just to use it as an example, because it is originally a spoken and not a written language. So there is no standardized way of spelling certain words or spelling certain phrases, but there is a standardized grammatical structure. But with that said, I think it's really helpful to give context to the language. For example, in the Gullah language, the word "e" can be used to mean she, he, it, and they. And it also can be conjugated without changing the word itself. So, and it's like kind of like doubles as a verb. So for example, if you were to say, like, where is she? Or I have to think about it the Gullah way first. For example, if I were to say, like where he at, it's like, where is he? Or he over there, he's over there. Or like eager lose, he's going to lose. So I think it's helpful to have a speaker who isn't of that language, or who doesn't speak Gullah, or who does speak Gullah but is choosing to speak in a standard form of English, to interact with that character. So for example, if a character is speaking in Gullah, then I would have a character who is speaking in standard American English respond and interact, just to give some context and just to help readers have a frame of reference for what's being said. So if a character says, like, where you at? And then another character will respond, oh, it's over there. So you understand now the question was, where is it? So that's what I do.
Heck yeah. And I do not want to confuse and say Gullah and conlang the same thing, and my apologies in that. Just had that you had mentioned using it in a book, and so wanted to grab an example from you. But
Yes,
Monique, have you, sorry?
No, go ahead.
Have you created a conlang in any of your work?
I've tried. I've tried.
That's a great answer. I've tried too.
It's really hard, it's really hard. It's really hard to create one, especially if I always like to. When I tried to make one, I tried to base it off of an existing like breathing language, kind of like Gullah was created based on different languages and cultures, of course. So I tried to do the same thing when I create conlang. But I think the danger, or the thing I try to avoid when I do that, is I think about representation and also which characters are being given certain languages. Like, are the characters of a poorer class, or who have it worst off as in terms of class in society, are they being given languages that are typically spoken by people of African descent or of indigenous backgrounds? So I think you have to be careful when you're doing that. But haven't been brave enough yet. Haven't done it.
That's great though, and we're happy to have you here because we're talking through this and all the different influences, both real world and imagined. They come together. So really, it's important to have everybody along the way, and really, you being here as an author who is working on conlangs is great. Absolutely. Let me throw this out there then. Let me see. How do you ease a reader into a conlang? CJ, you're talking about a pictorial one. How do you ease a reader into a pictorial conlang?
Sure. It's actually pictographic logographic. So it's basically an ideograph in a way, which means that the image represents an idea, and it can also represent a sound or a word. So I do have two conlangs in my novel, which they could be considered dialects, the language of choice and the language of fate. But before we get deeper into that, I'd like to piggyback off of what Anna said and just add one caveat there. Is it's also important to notice what kind of words don't exist within a language. As Monique and Anna mentioned about what representation we can provide with the language, there are certain human languages that exist where we, for instance, don't have the word empathy in that language. So does that mean that those cultures don't have empathy? Not necessarily. They just may never have had a need to represent that linguistically. There are also cultures that don't have words for psychopath or other words, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those things don't exist within the constructs of that society. So it's really interesting when you start to play with what exists and what doesn't exist. So you can leave out a few things, and it may be that that society is quite innocent and has never encountered psychopathy, but when in the course of your fictional timeline, perhaps they do. So there's a lot you can play with there. But the way I ease my readers is I just drop them in. Language is instinctual. It's learned through seeing and mimicry, and through hearing, seeing, and mimicry often, and immersive within environments. So I give my reader the trust that they will start to figure out certain aspects of the language. They'll start to form their own opinions about the way things sound. So me as a reader, whenever I encounter a conlang within a written work, I don't always go to the glossary or the index that shows how it's supposed to sound or what it's supposed to mean. I try to figure it out on my own, and I do hope that my readers will do the same because it's pictographic. Yeah, I just kind of drop them in and give them that trust that, hey, listen, you're gonna stay with me on this journey, and eventually, piece by piece, I start to unravel how this particular pictograph or this logograph is important within the storyline, and the reader will have to have a collective memory as they go through. But of course, I won't be too cruel to them. At the end of the book, I'll probably include a glossary, maybe.
I mean, there's a Silmarillion and, just huge text of Elven that is not translated anywhere else. You have to go to a completely different text or some notes that were released 50 years later to even know what's happening. But there is something to be said for putting into a book, a block of text or a phrase or something like that they might not understand. I have this like scale of movies where if you're doing it in one language, like you have a certain audience that speaks that language. You do it in two languages, you have a certain audience who is either okay with reading, at the bottom of the screen, or can understand two languages. You get to three, and there's like no audience. There's individuals all over the place that can understand it. But once a movie is, includes three languages, then that film kind of has to stand on its own merits and outside of language. So, this whole thing of easing people into a conlang, what does it bring to it? Maybe I can throw this at Anna. How does using a conlang create a class and geographic distinction?
Well, probably in the same way that happens in the real world. But like there's your intention as an author, and you have to introduce the audience to what the differences are, and so I think probably like that, just you as the author have to figure out like, okay, so what does this mean? Like what dialect or sociolect is spoken in this group? Which other dialect, sociolect is spoken elsewhere? What does that mean with regard to history in the world, first of all? And then I guess you have to be mindful of like this whole the appropriation issue that what are you drawing on from the real world, and how responsibly do you do that? That is also a question. Yeah,
that is a very big question, and I have to touch on this regarding conlangs, and it goes to using real languages in books as well. There was the very high profile example in early 2020 of oh no, I'm going to blank on the name of the book. The woman from New York City who decided to write a book about a woman coming across the Mexican border, and the way she used Spanish in it was really not so cool, because she would say things like, I was walking down the street to my casa. That means house. And it was like, no. Nobody, this is not ringing a bell. Okay, I'm gonna have to look it up, and we'll find out at that. But there have been a lot of authors, and I'm gonna put it to sci-fi and fantasy, and I'm gonna put it to talking about conlangs and creating conlangs based on existing languages. But this has been white colonial thinking, and white authors, usually white male authors, coming in and using influences from around the world and saying, look, I created something, on another planet. Does anyone have any comments about where we are today in 2020 and how things need to change as far as that goes regarding conlangs? Sorry.
Comments for
Please.
sure.
Yes, I want to hear it, please. I'm sorry to leave it so open.
No, it's okay. So I think that, like, as I mentioned earlier, anytime you create a language, you're always drawing from somewhere. No one creates a language in a vacuum, or no one creates art, period, in a vacuum. So you always have a source. I think that a lot of times, especially when I think of my culture, who very marginalized, very there's little known about it on a broader global kind of publication scale. Most of our books, or most books about the Gullah language, has been written by white people. And it's very rare that you'll find a book written like by us, for us. So I think the same can be said with fantasy and sci-fi. A lot of times someone sees a language or they hear something and, oh, it looks nice, it looks pretty, and I want it. And I want to use it in these different ways. And I think a lot of times there is either not an awareness of the harm that causes, or there is an awareness and there's a lack of care of the harm that can cause, especially when the people of those cultures don't profit from you using their culture or appropriating from it. and then you're not representing them as like living, breathing, complex human beings. So I think it's very it's a hot button issue for sure. And it's a complex one because as artists, we want to draw inspiration from other cultures and societies, but we have to be responsible when we do so.
CJ?
Yes, I agree with Monique that it is quite a complex issue. And I do believe that there has been a lot of bad representation regarding language assimilation into science fiction and fantasy. And largely that impacts the BIPOC community, the Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. I think it's a good idea if people keep in mind whenever you're creating a language that has borrowed aspects of it, usually those borrowed aspects come from cultures that have been misrepresented in the past. So they will likely come with due considerations. And also language is a living thing. So it does change from day to day. Even now, the languages that we're speaking to each other, this form of English is not the same that it was 100 years ago, and it won't be the same in 100 years from now. So the cultures that are represented, those languages are evolving within those cultures too. So it's a good idea if you're drawing from an inspiration or source, if you don't have any knowledge of that language outside of what you're doing purely for research, it's a good idea to talk to the people who speak it now. You know, and I understand that can be difficult, but for instance, if I was going to write a novel that included a language based on Gullah, I would probably reach out to Monique and get her experiences with speaking Gullah and how that impacts her day-to-day life. So I think it's important consideration to make moving forward. And because it's a complex issue, there's no real right answer that, okay, if you do this, you won't be misrepresenting any culture. However, I think if you move forward respectfully, any language can be drawn upon with inspiration.
Heck yeah, and thank you. And with respect, absolutely. My sensitivity readers are extremely important. No one person represents an entire culture or the spectrum of many different experiences within a diasporic culture, especially, but all the different people all over and getting paid. You know, in the case of a sensitivity reader, you are not asking a friend who happens to be of a different culture, hey, what do you think of this? You know, and get their answer, because they'll be like, yeah, that's fine, and just push it off. You know, you have to invest in someone who's going to give you real criticism. And if you're paying someone for their opinion on something, you're going to get an actual answer, because that's, you know, that's what they're getting paid for. You know, it's important to put that money into a community, you know, both to check yourself as an author and to be able to reach out and know people who you are writing about to some degree. Sorry, I'm getting slightly tangential, but I think that was important to say.
And John, I'd just like to add another point here is that it's also good to consider that names are an extension of language too. I've seen most recently a lot of poor representation when it comes to borrowing names from other cultures and other languages. For instance, most recently I saw a shish al-kebab in a novel, and I thought that was particularly heinous. You know, it's
that was the name of a person, was a food?
It was the name of a character. Yes, and they wanted, I believe they were trying to draw from an Arabic inspiration, and that's the name they came up with. Of course, we know within the Harry Potter series, there are several characters that are named quite heinously without due consideration. So I think that if you're going to name your characters in a certain way, try to figure out what names are appropriate and what names are actual names. You know, don't just use anything. Try to speak to people that have experience within that culture or that language, and you'll probably end up with a better story and a better representation for it.
Thank you, absolutely. Anna, do you have any comments to add or things about, you know, like historical examples of any of this?
not really historical examples, but two words sort of come to my mind, like tokenization and also fetishization, I guess. I've been thinking of that sometimes, that like my first language is German, and people very often say, "Oh, German sounds so harsh," and you always hear it shouted. And you know, I don't get offended, whatever, but it's I'm always very mindful that when I'm creating a conlang and I'm trying to figure out, you know, it's primarily it's going to be written, but I'm also trying to keep in the back of my mind, well, if it's going to be read maybe as a podcast or as an audiobook, what will it sound like? And I don't want to fall into a trap where it's like, you know, those sorts of things. Oh, French sounds so romantic, or German sounds so mean, or Finnish sounds so cute. You get that a lot. And I also sign American Sign Language, and you often hear people say, "Oh, it's such a beautiful language." Yeah, it's for sure, but it's a language. It can express ugly things. It can express anything. So I really try to be mindful of like, oh, if you know your language has these velar fricative sounds that German has, don't go, oh, that sound makes your character evil or something like that. I try to stay away from those kinds of things very consciously. And the other thing I sometimes see in books is like tokenization. Like you had this example of like one word from a different language thrown into a sentence. Make sure that makes sense. Like look at how people actually code switch. And again, like I'm German, so I'm always like, when I read a German character, and for some reason they always have to exclaim "Mein Gott" inside their English sentence. I'm like, nobody does that. Like, yeah, sure, you need to remind the reader that this character is German, but it comes across as kind of fake to me. So do your research. Like, how do people actually code switch if you want to use code switching? Yeah.
Absolutely. And, you know, it feels like with the Mein Gott thing, you know, touching on how people blend languages. And if we're talking about, and two authors who are thinking about using conlangs, there are definitely times when, I'm going to say English, but I mean, whatever language you're writing in, it's just that the majority of us are going to be writing to try to get published, and it starts in English at least. When you're putting those words in, you know, living in Houston, hearing Spanglish, it's very interesting where nouns will jump back and forth between English and Spanish, and verbs just run in Spanish the entire time. And so I can't say that if I was, you know, creating a conlang or a blended conlang, that I wouldn't take that influence of what that cadence is, where you stick, you know, with it. Or Anna, as you're saying German, and I was thinking about the contrast with that in French, letters that are all phonetic, you know, versus in French, where you can have a word like bird that has, I think, 9 letters in it, and you only pronounce 2 of them. When you're making a conlang, you know, like you're drawing from this earth and what we're living in today. So to be honorable to the resources that you're using, you know, make them plain or make them positive. And there's lots of good things to be said about spreading your influences around. Don't just feel like there's only the Western, you know, what can I say, Western European fantasy myth. There are many myths to draw upon, for sure. But I am talking too much and you guys are great. CJ, I'm going to go back to you on this. How can a conlang be something that brings a reader closer to the message of your work?
Oh, I think that's quite an easy question to answer. A conlang can bring the reader closer by essentially dropping them into the world. If you have a fictional work, you expect the reader to take some leaps with you and to immerse themselves within the world. But if they are constantly, for instance, like Anna said, code switching is a part of language. So if the reader themselves is code switching to their native language while reading your work, then there may be some disconnect. Providing a language to the reader allows them to be more fully immersed within that world and experience the world, because as they read, they will be speaking in their minds. It's how the brain processes language when it's a visual cue. So I think intrinsically it brings the reader closer. Another way it can is we all are parts of fandoms ourselves. I, for instance, love Tolkien languages. I love High Elvish, even though I do not speak it well. I don't speak it well. I probably could throw out a few words, but those languages stay with you even after you've read the work. So it's another piece of memorabilia. It's another piece of connection to the story that the reader can take away from it. And I think that provides a unique opportunity for any writer to connect with their readers, because you'll find fans that will go out and actually learn. For instance, Dothraki is a really good example of a very shallow language, in my opinion, that is not well done. However, was amazingly done by linguists for the show. And then the fandom started to learn more about the language, and now there are a lot of fans out there that can speak Dothraki to each other. And I would say that is a way of keeping the work alive, even after they've read it, they've watched the series. Now they're a part of it themselves, because as language is a living thing, the fandom picks up the language, then it starts to change. They interject their own words into the language, and I think that's quite a unique property.
Oh, absolutely. Oh my, there are a decent amount of fantasy languages that have been created over the year, but only a couple that have really caught on, to be spoken for sure. Monique, do you have anything to say about how using a conlang, using a different language can bring your reader closer to the message of your book?
Yes, I really liked some of what Anna was saying earlier, just about being careful about the, like, I guess the connotation or the weight you give a language, and who's saying what, and what tone is implied with the use of the language. I think that in our society, we use language to give value to a lot of things. For example, people who are more fluent speak a certain way, and people who are less affluent or form different social constructs, they have their own dialects and their own language. So I think in order to build the culture of your world, a great step could be considering what kind of world do you want to build. Is this a society where everyone is kind of like has equity and is treated without really a class system, or do you want to create a world that has a lot of separation and cultural differences, and that you can see kind of the disconnect between cultures? So I think establishing the culture of your story and then using language to reinforce that culture is a good way to add weight to a story. And even when I'm writing my work in progress now, I wanted both like the royals in society as well as the lower classes to all speak in the same dialect. Just because I think that that's really rare. I haven't really seen that happen in a lot of stories or even in life. But I wanted Gullah, a language that is usually or has been historically treated as less than, to be considered the standard, and to kind of normalize it in the society. So I think if you're trying to create norms and move away from Western normative standards, then you can do a lot of that with language.
Yes, that's great. And let me just bring up P. Jelly Clark's oh no, am I gonna forget the name of the book? Let me say this. So the last book, Ring Shout, absolutely, which has the real mom central figure of this revolution movement be a Gullah woman and bring her language into it, even though the story is in Georgia and elsewhere, and just really make her really revered. by the group, and put Gullah into that position, which was very interesting and very mystical as well. Anna, do you have anything to add on that, or should I ask you about robots?
Oh, please ask me about robots.
Okay.
So if I were to add something, I guess I don't really have anything to add because CJ and Monique have, said such interesting and important things. So, yeah.
So yeah, let me ask you about robots because I'm very interested. And do you think computer language is going to, come into English anytime soon?
I think it already has.
Okay, what's an example? I mean, you can say.
Of course, I'm drawing a blank, but I feel like that's a tricky question. I feel like when I'm coding and I'm trying to talk to a computer, coding languages are languages, and you have to learn them, and you have to, if you make an error, the computer will simply misunderstand you. And sometimes I think of language in terms of programming, and in a way it makes it less rich, and maybe it makes it richer. I don't really have a clear thought on this, but like if you're working with like if situation, so if this is true and then this is true, then do this, like an algorithm. Sometimes I structure my own thinking like that. It's definitely fun to play with, and if you spend some time with like in coding, it'll happen that you sort of start talking like a computer, like you would to a computer.
But I can see it in a fantasy created world, that like there is a certain group, or for some reason, the Mentats from Dune, who have become completely analytical, and structuring a conlang around, those kind of motions. And if someone comes in from somewhere else and they say something off the cuff or use a connotation instead of a denotation, the whole tribe just shuts you down. Like, no, we are not speaking to you. You do not make sense. End of program.
The computer will just throw an error, and that's it. Your program won't run, and you have to figure out what you said wrong. What is it that I said?
And it's in a speech that's like, like 10 minutes long that you've been saying, and I was like, I got one word wrong. Where is it?
It's what's really interesting on that topic is the way sometimes I'm afraid that we're teaching humans to speak more like a computer, while we are trying to make the computer understand a human better. So like when I'm talking to my digital assistant, I will just use like not a sentence, and I'll say something like living room TV on. Like I would never say that to a person, but I don't trust the computer yet to actually interact with me like the Star Trek computer or something like that. I think we're quite far away from that still.
Heck yeah. Let me throw this out to KJ. Absolutely. Have you used a glossary for a book in a conlang, like really try to put it out there for the reader?
Yes, kind of. I have a glossary, but when I first released Bloodflower, one of the ways I was using to get people to subscribe to my newsletter was I was putting out a monthly like word or phrase that you would find in the book. But then I just got completely overloaded and busy. And so that kind of stopped, and I started focusing on, helping some other authors release. And I have considered going back to that. I haven't done it yet, but there are plans in the future to kind of go, okay, you've read the book, here are some familiar phrases you can kind of play with.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you another question, and then I'll do kind of like a quick, what do they say? Go quick round, and get to everybody. So in this glossary, all languages have swear words and idioms. What's a swear word or an idiom in a conlang?
Like in my conlang? Or
yeah. Nobody's going to know what it means. You don't have to tell us.
Oh God, you put me on the spot. My brain's kind of frazzled. I'll tell you guys afterwards what happened.
Good. Okay.
Cut this out, but yes, I have a lot of swearing in my book, and I put a lot of it in conlang. Now, once I released it, a lot of that was gone, just because it didn't make sense to try to put these swear words in. But as far as an idiom, you know, I've got by the guardians, or damn the guardians, or by the light, things like that, that kind of hint at this religious structure, but this religious structure is actually based on how real stories about people that kind of go above and beyond their normal nature, they just do these heroic acts, and then all of a sudden they become known for these heroic acts, and cultures forget who they really are, that they were just people, and they kind of make them bigger than they go, and then it, you know, maybe they settled onto another world and it continued, and all of a sudden somebody else did it, and so now millions of years later they've got all these guardians, and they're not really dedicated to anything. Most people, you know, like Jaden's culture doesn't really believe they exist, but you know, you get to John's culture and everything is damn the guardians, you know, and it's a swear word, but it's a swear word because the whole northern region has broken down statues of the guardians. They've tried to cut out a lot of the reality that surrounds these people and sort of force this darker culture that where their only master is the 6 old men that sit in this one tower. You know, they run everything. They don't know why they run everything, but as you know, Bloodflower unfolds, and then eventually in Iron Star, you start to get a really stark view of why these men are running this one section of the world, and why this one section of the world has only humans when everywhere else is, you know, shifters and people that can turn into plants and, you know, full hives. It's just, there's so much in this world, but everything in the beginning is so focused on this dominant male heavy, like dark culture. So sorry, that kind of got off track.
No, but I love the flip of it, you know, so you have, you know, kind of like the one culture, oh, bless the guardians, the other one, damn the guardians, and that, you know, is an idiom and also a swear. So it totally works, absolutely. CJ, do you have any pictorial ideograms or swear words in a language that's unspeakable? And I'm using the wrong word again. I think you said it's not a pictogram.
It's a pictograph, but that's okay. It's close enough. Yeah, there are, it's not a swear word. So in the pictographic language, there are unspeakable words, unknowable words actually, because the pictographic language isn't meant to be spoken, but there are unknowable words which are taboo, and if known, they do have magical consequences. So within the story that does get explored. However, in another novel that I'm working on, there are some swear words, and they're drawn upon what exists within that village in the story. So one of the swear words is shiktan, and shiktan, I chose that as a swear word because it can be said very softly underneath the breath. It can be whispered, and it can also be yelled. So if you bump your toe, you can be like shiktan, or if somebody's walking away and you don't particularly like that person, you can be like shiktan, So that's why I chose it, and that goes back to drawing upon the sounds of the language that you want to emulate, and how you feel that word or that language could be used. So I think those are the foundational things. But yeah, and then there are the more milder forms, which would be like some of the young maidens in one of my novels, they use "oh summers" because that's all they've been exposed to. So I think the exposure and gender differences in the swear words is an interesting thing to explore. Just like in society, women are not seen as favorable if they swear, whereas it's a much more acceptable thing for men to do. But that's something that we can explore in our conlands and in our worlds as well, and I certainly do.
Yes, and I love that "oh summer" because just reminds me of someone moving from Iowa to New York City at 18 to go to college, and they're like, "oh shucks," and everybody around them is like, "what?" Monique, have you, created any idioms? Maybe swear words?
I haven't created any swear words, but there are a lot of nonverbal uses of like language in that I incorporate into my stories just because they're common with the Gullah language. So for example, like eye rolling or teeth smacking, or we have this expression and it can mean different things. It could be like, it's usually negative. Like you'll smack your teeth and then you'll go like, she, and that's like usually like, it can be like, oh my gosh, or it can be like, I'm definitely not doing that. Or so when you hear it, you know what it means. And then there's this other expression, but it's called like, you can either smack your teeth or don't, but it's like great day. But it's like it basically means like, oh my gosh. And it can be a positive, like you see someone who looks really good and you're like, great day, like he looks really good. Or like you have like like my students, most of them are Gullah, so they do it a lot. I'll assign them like a lot of work and they're like, great day. So it just depends. So I like playing with like nonverbal languages and just nonverbal expressions in my stories, just because they're just as important as the verbal languages.
Yeah. Anna, do you have anything to add on that?
I wish I haven't invented anything like that, but what a rich topic. Like if you look at, I used to teach English, and one of the things my students would always want to learn about were idioms in English. And why do you say these things? It's impossible to unravel unless someone explains it to you. And it's little things like, get out of here or something like that. Like, where does that come from? So often with idioms, when you look up where do they come from like ages ago, like some, I don't know, seafaring culture or fishing culture. And it adds a level of depth if you're inventing those, then you're also inventing an entire history, which KJ, you already did. So you may as well invent the idiom to go with that, but it asks you if you want to invent idioms and also swear words, I think is similar. You're really asked to invent a depth for your invented culture, for your constructed culture, and for your constructed language, which will make it richer. So amazing. Yeah, do go ahead and invent idioms. Amazing.
I gotta throw it out there about learning Spanish, just kind of like by being thrown in the fire, either in a kitchen or working in a warehouse here in Houston. And yeah, the swear words are the first things that you learn. And then it is what you're working with. So if you need to know knife, tomato, cut, those are 3 words, that you're going to get. If you're in a totally different context and you need to know, wrap t-shirts and pack, send them for packing, those are the first words you're going to learn. So there's a lot to be said about if you're working on a conlang, just do that partial one. As CJ mentioned about George R.R. Martin and putting together Dothraki, you are doing this in service of a book. It does not need to be like a huge thing. And at that, it's something that can come later. So you can just, leave the little drips of it, here, but you have started something that can really snowball into something either in your own work or with, a growing community after the fact. But thank you guys so much for everything. I'm gonna ask one last thing. What is your favorite language or dialect, real or conlang? Anna?
Becky Chambers, the color language, and I don't know how to pronounce that species.
That's awesome.
Iluans. Yes. That color
Yes.
language goes back to my fascination with languages that cannot be reproduced if you don't have the appropriate appendage, whatever, organ.
CJ?
I can't choose from existing languages from around the world because I love them all too much, but I would say fictional language, I would go with either High Elvish or Klingon because of the way that it's really been picked up by people, and I love that people speak it.
Nice. Monique?
It's hard to decide, but I'm just gonna represent and just say Gullah Geechee is my favorite.
Do it. Absolutely. That's great. And KJ, give you the last word on that.
Oh, goodness. Okay. So yes, High Elvish Sindarin is absolutely gorgeous. Quenya, you know, if you've ever subscribed to the Vineyard Tengwar, I don't know if they're still working, but they totally break down Tolkien's other language that's a little bit more archaic. And it's amazing how nitpicky they get into the actual linguistics of it. Denis, of course, because Denis is so complete and it is beautiful to listen to. And then, of course, Samashkir, you know, which is Sindarin. So.
That's great. And yes, please.
Sorry, I was going to say, and Monique, I swear I have been squealing this whole time. One of my clients is Gullah as well. And she has done the same thing. She's incorporated it into her fantasy and really pulled in a lot of her heritage and culture. So I'm dying to read both your books.
Well, let me get to this real quick. I'm throwing a question at the end then. KJ, as well as Monique, in talking about a language that is oral, do you, when trying to write it, do a full phoneticization, or, you know, are there, you know, shortcuts? Is there another strategy?
I personally use phonetics to help me understand the sounds. So like the more archaic Samashkir it's every sound has its own character, you know. So with a lot of that, I really got into I lost my train of thought. Monique, go.
Okay, KJ. For me, this was really hard because, what I actually did was I went around to like all of the elders and all of the people my age and like my family members, and I asked them, how do you spell this word? And I like compiled a list of all the different spellings, and then I just like chose from like the top spelling option. But it's hard because sometimes things are phonetic, but then sometimes phonetic words look like other words, so it's kind of hard to decide. For example, like the word in Gullah for children is, we say like either churn, or some people say chillin', but that can look like oh, I'm just chilling, or it can look like churn, like, you know, you're churning some butter. So it's definitely hard to decide. So I usually go the phonetic route and then using the top selection from a list of people who speak the language.
Nice.
I also have to mention, I don't know if anybody's ever read Ivan Cat, but he made an incredible language with his fuzzy characters, and they can speak English with humans, but they have these ears that they move back and forth. And so when they talk to each other, they actually have their own language that specifically involves the ears. And they can talk to each other, and humans have no idea what they're saying unless they actually have studied the fuzzy linguistics. So I love anything, physical too, that can really show how that character is reacting to the words.
Body language is a language. Absolutely. Heck yeah. Well, thank you guys so much, Anna, CJ, Monique, and KJ, for joining us to talk about creating fantasy languages. And thank you guys so much for joining us on the WriteHive Conference 2022. Lots of other great panels to enjoy, and I do hope you all have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Bye.